The wife has decided to suddenly file for divorce, but what is the reason for all this? Today's story unfolds with a similar plot. Enjoy it. I stood in the doorway, looking at the screaming brunette. The pouring rain had plastered her hair to her face in long strands. Despite the freezing downpour, she continued her furious outburst. To be completely honest, I couldn't make out all of her words through the roar of the storm and the emptiness ringing in my own ears. However, I grasped the essence of what was happening. My wife, Claire, was having an affair with the brunette's husband, Mark. The infuriated brunette, Sophia, or Sophie as her friends called her, wanted me to put an end to it. I discovered this a couple of months back. My wife of 9 years had called me while I was on a rare business trip, and as I watched the cold rain spatter against the window of a gloomy apartment, she said she wanted a divorce because we were growing apart. I had only been gone for a couple of weeks, and we had only lived in this new town for 5 months after I left my job as a software engineer. I didn't even know we had issues. She never mentioned anything about it. From what I could piece together, she had been emotionally involved with this guy for about 3 months and was probably able to arrange everything physically while I was away on business. I hadn't managed to connect all the dots until a week before the brunette showed up at my doorstep. Even then, I still didn't have proof and was still trying to come up with a plan. My wife had agreed to go to therapy as a courtesy long before I learned of the affair, but she actually stopped attending our joint sessions after the second one. I suspected she was attempting to convince the therapist to steer me toward accepting the inevitable breakup. I think the main reason for the supposed therapy was so she could tell her family and friends how hard she was trying, especially her parents. Appearances in their eyes were incredibly important, perhaps the most important thing in her world. So, she served her time, continuing to see the guy and living off my salary until she was sure everything would look perfect, and he would be ready to leave his own wife and child. While she was buying waves of expensive shoes to stuff her closet, Claire and I had 2-year-old twins, Emma and Ava. She happily left me with them as soon as I got home so she could go to the gym or out for a run, both activities she did often enough to stay in the best shape of her life. But after the gym, she and that guy would sneak away to spend the evening together somewhere. Unhappy is hardly a word to describe my feelings. Whenever I tried to address our issues or speak with her about anything, she would explode into a fit of rage, denying any wrongdoing and blaming me for every problem in the universe. She also spent a lot of time telling me how tough it was for her to watch the kids while I was at work, how she was the one making all the effort, and that I was just trying to use the children against her, none of which was remotely true. With her gone nearly every evening and most weekends, I watched the kids more hours a week than she did while maintaining a full-time job. The conversation with the lawyer about the divorce was utterly disheartening. Infidelity actually had no significance in our state. It was possible to file for divorce on these grounds, but it carried no real consequence, and Claire was well aware that the court almost always awarded custody and substantial child support to the wife, regardless of her behavior. Child support for several years was also the norm if there were young children involved. This way, the ex-wife could remain at home and be a good mother rather than rush into the workforce. So, there stood the screaming brunette, a rather unpleasant specimen, tall and somewhat ungainly, with something resembling a beak for a nose and thin, scowling lips, still soft in the middle after the birth of her 6-month-old child, with a few extra pounds that, frankly, didn't sit well on her figure. The combination of fury and cold rain made her pale skin blotchy. I couldn't get a word in edgewise, so I stepped back, holding the door open, and gestured for her to come inside. I realized that the neighbors shouldn't hear a woman yelling at me without a buffer. I'd already had plenty of experience with that lately. She followed me, continuing to loudly degrade my character as I walked to the dining room and pulled out a chair for her, then sat down myself and waited. As she began to calm down, her rage morphed into bitter tears, then into shaking sobs, and finally into sniffling, as her head fell into her hands on the table, her hair forming a wet, limp, dark brown mess. I waited a little longer until the sniffling ceased. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. She raised her head, eyes red from crying, and sobbed twice but didn't utter a word. So, I continued, if I could do something, I would. I don't like it any more than you do. I proceeded to explain how the law worked and how I was at a disadvantage. You need to kick that creep out, she yelled. It wouldn't be long before she would let go of her fury, not that I could blame her. Great idea. And then I'd end up in jail and eventually on the streets, instead of in my own home, I thought wryly. We sat in silence for a while until I stood up and prepared some hot tea. I did my best not to let my gaze linger on her. She might not have been a classic beauty, but she had truly attractive curves, and I hadn't seen anything like that up close for a long time. She shivered as the steaming tea warmed her hands. Geez, I didn't realize I was this cold, she said. I didn't respond, but she suddenly glanced down at her chest. Damn, she mumbled again, not the most creative with words. She hugged herself awkwardly, trying to conceal her discomfort. I sighed inwardly. It was the closest I had gotten to intimacy in 4 months. I can get you a sweater or something, as long as it's not that thing, I offered. I went to the closet and pulled out one of my hoodies. She quickly slipped it on and buttoned it up. She started shifting around, pulling her arms out of the sleeves, and then, after a few twists, dropped her damp shirt and bra underneath before pulling her arms back through the sleeves. I picked up her clothes and tossed them in the dryer. Then I grabbed a towel and handed it to her. For your hair. Thanks, she murmured as she began drying her hair. It was strange to feel drawn to something at that moment. Damn, I'd almost forgotten what it was like to feel desire, so I allowed myself to stare. Eventually, her hair dried out, and she lowered the towel. I hate them, she spat out. Same here. I never saw it coming. I could see the pain in her eyes, a pain that echoed my own. I can't compete with her. She's in perfect shape, and she's gorgeous. I'm just fat after having a baby. She wasn't really overweight, maybe just a few extra pounds. She was a little out of shape, but so was I. But in a way, she wasn't completely wrong. Claire was stunning in a way that you don't often see in real life. Blonde, blue-eyed, slender, and graceful in the way only a few people can be. Still, Sophie needed something to latch on to. She's fit because she's got the time to go to the gym and run. And you're not fat, I said softly. A tiny flicker of something other than despair appeared in her eyes. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged. I have no clue. No matter how I look at it, I'm stuck alone, with no money, and she holds control over the kids. I shared with her the bits and pieces I'd managed to put together. What if you have evidence? She asked. It wouldn't matter. Courts don't care about that. The same things that hurt me won't have any impact for you in court either. No way. Mark works for his cousin at an IT consulting firm. Most of his pay is off the books, so there's barely any legitimate income to claim for child support or maintenance. I figured she meant spousal support. She continued, I just want to ruin them. I paused, considering her words. What could we really do to hurt them? She shrugged. I carried on, starting to feel a slight sense of hope. I might finally have an ally in this chaos of fools. Honestly, everyone's got something to hide. We just need to find it. The off-the-books paycheck from his cousin might be a good starting point. I mulled it over. Some of the new shoes that recently appeared in Claire's closet looked extremely pricey. The money for them had to be coming from somewhere. Something's going on. Claire is spending money from somewhere. She nodded, and for a moment, I saw a spark of determination in her eyes. We could look into it, she suggested. I chuckled. It'll be a piece of cake. We'll round up the kids and sneak around like a bad parody of Magnum P.I. meets the Brady Bunch. No, my sister Anna can watch the kids. She's already looking after Jamie at my place right now. She seemed to be deep in thought, looking a bit nostalgic. So, where are your children? She asked. They're upstairs, asleep. She glanced around the room, her eyes stopping at the closed front door. Do you have some sweatpants? I'm still drenched. I moved to the folded laundry and grabbed my sweatpants. As she stepped out of her wet shoes, I handed them over and motioned her toward the bathroom. The gesture was pretty clear, and I could almost sense her nerves crackling in the air. I understood the risk she was taking. She already felt rejected. If a guy with a chip on his shoulder, who had every reason to seek vengeance and who had been starved for affection for as long as I had, turned her down, it would crush her. I felt a sudden rush of anger, but it wasn't directed at her, it was aimed at Claire for putting me in this situation. Sophie continued, I can't believe Mark could do this to me. I stepped closer and gently placed one hand on her bare side. She shivered, and her voice hitched in her throat, but she didn't pull away, so I put my other hand on her opposite side. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I don't like you, but I despise him. She leaned back into me. I let my hand trace her side and unbuttoned her hoodie with the other, letting it slide down to the floor at our feet. Her skin was still cold from the rain, and she seemed to melt into the warmth of my embrace. She gazed up at me darkly from beneath her unruly curls of red hair. You knew this would happen when you invited me in, she murmured. Honestly, not until you took off your jeans, I admitted. She giggled like a schoolgirl, which was somewhat disconcerting. I was terrified that you'd turn me away. I smiled, a genuine one that I hadn't felt in ages. Who could resist you? Mark? No surprise. I think watching the baby being born did it. He was there in the room. He got queasy, vomited, and hasn't shown any interest in me or the baby since. I shook my head slowly. I've heard about this sort of thing, but... Before I could finish, she interjected. So, how could Claire, any woman, turn down the kind of night you gave me? You're so much better than Mark. I have no clue. She just lost interest. Mark is younger, and she probably felt old and unattractive after having the kids. It hasn't been the same, I gestured toward the towels, since the twins were born. I think she convinced herself that she needed to be more maternal to me or something. I'll be sore, but I'll keep it in mind, especially when the idiot tells me to sleep in Jamie's room tonight because he's tired from all his so-called training. I can't believe you can't manage to. I still don't like you. There was a sharp edge in her words, but we both knew it wasn't really aimed at each other. The dryer buzzer interrupted us. I chuckled. If you really want to do something about this, see if your sister can babysit my kids along with yours tomorrow night, and we better wrap things up. They'll be back in about an hour, and I need to catch some sleep. Here. I'll be here. Better use some air freshener because this place reeks of hot, sweaty intimacy. She slipped back into her clothes and practically pranced out of the house. I meticulously cleaned the room and tossed the towels and sweatshirt into the washing machine along with my own clothes. When Claire came home, it was surprisingly easy to dodge our usual evening routine, the argument we'd fall into where she'd deny everything and make excuses for every lie. She seemed a bit bewildered by my uncharacteristically calm demeanor. It's funny how a night full of passionate anger can ease the tension. She also appeared to notice how spotless the kitchen was. I think she commented on the heavy use of air freshener, but honestly, I didn't care. I was still riding the wave of post-climactic bliss. She was also taken aback when I didn't go through the almost ritualistic failed attempt to kiss her goodbye before leaving for work the next morning. I didn't even bother, and I could see how my sudden indifference caught her off guard when I just grabbed my keys and walked out. One way or another, I was done sitting around, feeling sorry for myself. I'd find a way to end this, whatever it took, **** at work, I agreed to borrow a colleague's car for the next few months. With Sophie's sister, who bore a surprising resemblance to her, watching over the kids at home, we set off. Our strategy was to scout out the office trailer of her cousin's construction company. If there was any illicit activity going on, this might be the perfect place to start tracking it down. When she got into the car, she shivered slightly. "It's the first time I've had a night like that in ages, and you weren't exactly gentle. Don't think you're getting any rewards today," she teased with a small, playful smile. I arched an eyebrow. "Gentleness wasn't really on your mind." She let out a small smile despite her attempts to stay composed. I noticed this was the first time I'd ever seen her wearing makeup, albeit casually applied. Changing gears, I decided to shift the plan and drove us to the nearby mall. We tried to hold a conversation, but the reality was, we had very little in common. The chat fell flat until we pulled into a shopping center's parking lot. She gave me a puzzled look. "Why are we here?" she asked. "We're not here for anything related to the office," I clarified. "You're here. I think we can hold off on playing Philip Marlowe for now. If we want this to hurt them, we should aim for a few small victories first." "Philip who?" She rolled her eyes, and I marveled at just how little Sophie and I really shared in common. She shot me a sideways glance of annoyance. "I still don't like you," she muttered bluntly. Ignoring her statement, I led her to the cosmetics counter at Macy's. She glared at me suspiciously. "Think of this as a form of going undercover," I said. Over the next hour, the women at the counter buzzed around her, trying out countless makeup combinations. Eventually, they managed to create a polished look for Sophie and showed her how to apply it all by herself. She didn't exactly transform into a supermodel, but she exuded a sort of sultry allure, something captivating and intense. "This will do," I declared. The entire set drained $100 from my grocery budget, but I figured I'd just skip lunch at work for the next few weeks. We got back into the car, and she held the small cosmetics bag as if it were the Holy Grail. She didn't want to admit it, but I could tell she enjoyed the transformation. "So, what was that all about?" she asked, confusion tinged with curiosity. "If we want to hit them where it hurts, you need to have something that Mark feels like he's lost. And I need something to make Claire burn with jealousy. It's all about perception. You'll hide your makeup when you're at home, and only wear it when we're out together." She looked puzzled, so I went over the whole scheme in detail. She was silent for a full minute, letting the plan sink in. "Wow. It's a bit convoluted and might take a while to play out," she finally said. I shrugged. "Do you have a better idea or plan?" She smirked slightly. "Nope." She then asked me to swing by her place so she could take off the makeup, ensuring Mark wouldn't notice anything. She disappeared into the bathroom and emerged a few minutes later, carrying a towel and wearing nothing but an impish smile and the makeup she hadn't yet removed. The mischievous gleam in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about her current intentions. I scrutinized her. "I thought you said not to expect anything," I remarked. Her grin widened. "Well, it'd be a shame to let all this makeup go to waste." We finally headed over to her sister's house after. Sophie had brought her sister on board, an accomplice in our game. It seemed her sister wasn't particularly fond of Mark, and we would need her help, quite a bit of it over the coming months. For the most part, we stayed in. I would work out during my lunch breaks, she kept up her workouts at home, and the two of us trained together in the basement until Sophie shed her post-pregnancy weight and sculpted her figure back into shape. I bulked up considerably as well. We concealed it from our self-centered partners by donning loose-fitting clothes and being vague. Even so, they hardly noticed us. We also spent nights together at least 5 to 6 times a week, which was far more frequent than I'd ever been intimate with Claire. Since we both used to be stay-at-home-with-family types, we decided to switch things up. The basement of my house became a dance studio. Sophie and I knew absolutely nothing about dancing at first, but thanks to the wonders of YouTube, we gradually got the hang of it. We spent many weekends and evenings practicing while our spouses continued to ignore us. We mastered the basics before moving on to more advanced steps. We really took a liking to salsa, but we had to save it for the end of our sessions, mostly because, every single time, we ended up having sex on the floor. One thing became clear very quickly: I was messing with fire. Sophie wasn't exactly the most stable person. She had the temperament of a half-wild pit bull. Her mood would shift unexpectedly, and nearly anything could set her off into an unpredictable fit of anger. This entire situation with Claire and Mark had shattered something critical. One of those invisible boundaries of sanity had been breached. I made it a point to keep an eye on her at all times. The only moments she seemed calm and steady were right after she was physically spent or when she was around kids, hers or mine. Her affection for children was undeniably powerful. We were like frenzied animals in bed, constantly. The shared contempt in our relationship meant that nothing was too harsh or too inappropriate, and we both exploited that. She still called me moron, and I called her dummy, but the insults, though far from being sweet nothings, held a peculiar tenderness. It was our way of making each other feel less broken. But the real work still needed to be done, and we had to execute it with utmost precision. It took a month and a half of staking out the construction company's trailer before we managed to get inside. We only got that chance because Mark carelessly left the keys unattended, and we made a duplicate. Sophie found an excuse to visit the trailer during the day and filmed everything on her phone. It turned out that Mark's cousin was too much of a miser to install a security system. We infiltrated the trailer 5 times in the evenings, photographing every single document in every drawer. We slowly sifted through them, piece by piece. Even more valuable information was found in Mark's desk and Claire's purse. After a while, we noticed something strange: neither of us were arguing with our spouses anymore. This became an issue for Claire. She seemed to actually miss the disputes and tried picking fights for no apparent reason, but I never took the bait, or almost never. Truthfully, after having sex with Sophie all day, I didn't have the energy left to engage in those pointless battles. It took me some time to realize that Claire was likely using these fights to justify her own immoral behavior. Each day, she grew more bewildered. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to believe that Sophie had given up and moved on. I also managed to come out ahead financially. I received a $2,000 refund for a vacation bungalow I had been planning to book at a Mexican beach resort. I'd been preparing for an anniversary trip with Claire, an event that obviously didn't happen and never will. I hadn't expected to get any money back, but surprisingly, they refunded it. Customer service, I guess. This windfall would certainly come in handy. When Claire started coming up with excuses to spend the night at Mark's, Sophie and I began hitting up dance clubs, testing out the moves we'd been practicing. It was entertaining, but not without its challenges. Sophie's unpredictability kept me on edge. She could shift from being cheerful to borderline psychotic anger with no warning at all if the wrong button was pushed. One particular night nearly turned into a catastrophe, serving as a stark reminder of how vigilant I needed to be. By this time, after weeks of practice and almost daily intimacy, Sophie was exuding a powerful allure, so it wasn't shocking that people frequently interrupted us on the dance floor. She thrived on the attention but, as expected, showed empathy toward jilted girlfriends and tried to steer clear of men who were already taken. Unfortunately, some guys assumed she would dance with them just as provocatively as she danced with me, which was not going to happen. One evening, a couple approached us in a secluded club on the outskirts of town. I was dancing with a girl, a petite blonde with a cheerleader vibe, while a guy tried to slip his hands under Sophie's miniskirt. She warned him twice, but he persisted. I simply grabbed Sophie by the hair as she lunged toward him. "Stop," I commanded firmly. Her sharp nails came dangerously close to his eye, leaving bloody streaks on his cheek. With the little blonde by her side and a hissing, furious Sophie gripping her hair, I immediately braced for the worst. The guy recoiled quickly, his eyes wide, as Sophie slowly turned her gaze toward me, wrapping her long leg around my waist and pressing her hips tightly against mine. "You pulled my hair." It hurts. She paused, then purred, "You really know what I like, don't you?" She glanced at the blonde standing beside me, then winked at her. "You can do better than this puffed-up jock. You deserve more." We swiftly headed toward the exit. It seemed like the best move, considering the three men in security shirts approaching us. The parking lot was packed with cars but deserted of people. 2 rows over, I spotted a bruised-up guy and 2 others getting out of a vehicle. He marched toward Sophie while his friend zeroed in on me. Sophie smirked. "I didn't know you knew my name." She suddenly froze, appearing frightened, as he reached out, attempting to grab her wrists. But I could see the unhinged glint in her eyes as I felt the largest of the 3 men closing in on me from behind. Sophie lunged, not with her hands, but with her teeth, sinking them deep into the side of his face. He let out a high-pitched, agonized scream that echoed through the night. I spun around sharply. I wasn't an MMA champion, but I had been in my fair share of brawls. When I saw the wild fury in Sophie's eyes, I knew I was ready. The big guy expected a fight or a swing, but he was caught off guard by his friends wailing and completely unprepared when I threw a solid elbow into his face. Bracing for a wild punch, he leaned right into my blow, causing his nose to crunch loudly. He dropped to the ground, clutching his face and groaning in pain. The second guy stepped forward to pull Sophie away from her shrieking victim, so I kicked the back of his leg, striking his knee and forcing him down. I grabbed his head and kicked it like a football, letting it collide with the pavement with a deafening thud. Sophie's attacker stumbled backward over the curb, an enormous mistake. Sophie spat out a piece of flesh, at least, I hoped that's what it was, and drove her stiletto heel into his groin. His scream ascended beyond human comprehension, an agonized howl that reverberated through the empty lot. I yanked her back as she prepared to punch him again in the chest. "Sophie, stop!" I yelled. She glared at me with a defiant, almost manic expression before pausing and smirking. She slowly turned around and rested her hand on the nearest car, standing triumphantly over her writhing, suffocating victim. "Take me here, right now, and I'll let him go," she purred seductively. I would never have thought that something like this could arouse me, but it did. Against my better judgment, I pulled Sophie into the shadows of the car, feeling the adrenaline and chaos of the night surge through my veins. As I stepped away from her and zipped up, I noticed a couple of figures standing about 15 feet away in the parking lot, a petite blonde and a gothic girl with dark hair, both standing in shock. Sophie then noticed the startled blonde and began walking toward her. I wanted to grab Sophie and run, but I knew that if I didn't get her out of there quickly, we'd both be in jail by sunrise. She approached the stunned blonde and stood over her. "Sophie, be nice." "She didn't do anything wrong," I said, trying to calm her. Sophie looked back at me with a twisted smile. "Oh, I know. It's not her fault." She then pulled the blonde closer and kissed her passionately. I was about to step in when I realized the blonde was kissing her back just as eagerly. Sophie gradually released her. The blonde stared at her, mesmerized, her face smeared with the blood of her own boyfriend. "Believe me, sweetheart, you can find someone much better than him," Sophie whispered softly. I saw the goth girl support the blonde when her legs buckled. Once we were back in the car, Sophie yanked off her top and used it to wipe her face. An ambulance wailed in the distance, about 2 miles away. I didn't have to guess where it was heading. I could only hope no one recalled our faces or our license plate number. I pulled into a rest stop and offered Sophie my shirt, but putting on clothes wasn't her immediate concern. She remained silent for a few minutes, then murmured, "I'm really messed up, aren't I?" We're all messed up about something. But I really enjoyed it. It felt so good to hurt him. Yeah, I noticed. It's a little unsettling, like something out of a horror movie. Hurting him felt almost intimate. I could release all that rage. He deserved it. Well, I doubt the law would see it that way, but I think his girlfriend didn't mind too much. Sophie laughed and stuck her tongue out at me. Damn, I guess I've got some competition. She paused thoughtfully. Is this just about causing pain? Don't let me do this again. Promise me, she pleaded softly, her eyes glistening with tears. You were protecting yourself. I know, but it wasn't really self-defense. I wanted to hurt him, badly. What if it happens again? What if I can't stop myself? What if I can't find my way back? Suddenly, she seemed like a frightened little girl, lost in the dark. It genuinely terrified me. Sophie probably needed professional help, medication, therapy, maybe even to be committed to a psychiatric facility. A few days later, our altercation made the headlines. The newspaper reported a brutal attack in a parking lot, attributing it to a gang of 6 men and a Latina woman, according to an eyewitness, Cream Puff, whose real name, it turned out, was Amber. I couldn't help but laugh when I showed Sophie the article. So, you seem to have made quite an impression on Amber, I teased. Sophie grinned. I thought she was cute. Strawberry-flavored lipstick. Do you like girls? I didn't think so, I was just messing with her in the club, but in the parking lot, it felt different. She wanted me. I sensed it, and that made me want her. I held her gaze. While you were with me. She wanted me to be with her. I saw it in her eyes. And since you and I have been together, I've lost all boundaries when it comes to intimacy. After that incident, Sophie struggled to regain control over herself. It got better, slowly, unevenly, but there was progress. I could see her fighting to keep her inner demons at bay when they surfaced. Sometimes she even succeeded. We kept going to clubs, but we were much more cautious and relaxed now. Sophie's sister couldn't watch the kids every night, and I wasn't about to give up all my time with my little angels, so Sophie would often bring Logan over. We'd exercise after putting them to bed, checking on them every now and then until it was time for Sophie to leave. As we stood in the doorway, looking in on them, I would sometimes steal a glance at Sophie and marvel at the softness in her expression that never seemed to be there at other times. Occasionally, she caught me looking and gave me a sad, gentle half-smile. At such moments, her demons seemed very far away. Sooner or later, I knew something would happen. Claire eventually caught me shirtless and noticed my weight loss and new muscles. She commented on it, and I chalked it up to stress. She tried to turn it into an argument, but I had already put on my shirt and left the room. Mostly, I wanted to avoid her seeing Sophie's nail marks on my back from the night before. I sensed that she didn't believe me. Claire's growing suspicion meant we had to move on to the next phase. So, I told Sophie it was time for more Philip Marlowe stuff. She rolled her eyes at me over her shoulder as I was caught up in the moment with her. A few days later, instead of spending the night together, we borrowed a car and brought a nice digital camera, ready for action. When Claire and Mark left, we quietly followed them at a distance. This wasn't real stalking. Sophie intercepted receipts and credit card statements until we had a clear picture of their routine. Claire was cautious and calculated, but in Mark's mind, Sophie was shattered and powerless, so he acted recklessly and foolishly. Mark's parents owned a small cottage near the coast, secluded in the woods. It was run down and modest, but the mileage on the car confirmed that this was where they went on Fridays when they ditched the gym altogether. We turned off the road and quietly approached the cottage with the camera in hand. There were no curtains, so it wasn't difficult to find them and observe. They were already unclothed on the bed when we got into position. Claire was actively engaged with Mark. I carefully and quietly took photos while Sophie and I watched. I felt Sophie tugging at my jeans, pulling them down despite my half-hearted attempts to stop her. She went right to work. Perhaps I didn't resist as much as I should have. I tried to get her to take the situation seriously since we still needed to get back to the car unnoticed. I let some air out of one of Mark's tires to delay them if they decided to leave early. We took the film to a discreet darkroom that specialized in one-day photo processing and then headed home. Claire arrived much later than usual, her clothes and hair disheveled. The next day, a gleeful Sophie informed me that Mark had replaced a flat tire and then ran over a nail on the way home, resulting in a grueling journey in the rain to get a tire patch at a shop 4 miles away. As they used to say in the army, revenge is a dish best served cold, and its name is karma. Over the following week, Sophie and I had a lot of deep conversations, really meaningful talks, about what we wanted to do next. Sophie surprised me to the core, but in the end, I agreed. We stayed quiet and patient, then executed our big move. Around 3 weeks after we had gathered all our evidence, Claire and Mark vanished for the entire day on a Saturday. Sophie and I had figured out their routine perfectly. First, they'd go to the gym, then to the cottage for sex and a shower, then head to the nightclub to dance and let loose. They usually returned home around 6 o'clock or 7 a.m. on Sunday morning, but this time, things were going to unfold a bit differently. As soon as they left, we took the kids to Sophie's sister's place and hit the road. First, we went shopping. Sophie chose a tight dress in a rich emerald color with a deep neckline and a very short hem. The emerald green color really brought out her hair. I had a dark gray suit with a black t-shirt. I took her to a full-blown beauty salon and told them to do whatever they wanted with her hair and makeup. Dressed to kill, we headed to the club. We walked in as if it belonged to us. Theoretically, the bartender should have checked on us, but Sophie looked like pure sin on a stick. A million squats gave her an alluring figure that could stop traffic, and she wasn't wearing jeans. She was wearing a paper-thin dress that hid almost nothing. It was obvious there wasn't a thread of underwear beneath it. Since one of the bartender's jobs is to ensure the crowd is interesting, we were let in without showing any ID. First, we went to the dance floor, letting the pulsating music take over. Then, we continued to the main event. I asked a friend to check where Mark and Claire usually sat at the club, and it turned out they always occupied the same corner booth every Saturday. After we danced a few songs, we headed to their table. Sophie walked proudly forward, holding my hand. Claire was wearing a yellow dress that I had never seen before, and Mark was dressed in a blue suit. I'd be lying if I said Sophie looked better than Claire. Claire was tanned and elegant, however, Sophie was captivating. Rather than looking refined or sophisticated, she proudly carried a bad girl aura of pure, unfiltered seduction and immorality, drawing glances from all over the room. I pulled out a chair at their table for Sophie and then sat down myself. Claire and Mark appeared to be frozen in absolute shock. I looked around with artificial surprise. Very nice. Most gyms are less fancy, I commented dryly. Mark's face darkened, and he glared at Sophie. That dress, you spent money on it? No, I did, I interjected with sternness in my voice. I threw a stack of photos onto the table. These were the most disgusting pictures I could find. Most of the photographs I took were much more compassionate because they were of beautiful people. But I chose the worst ones in the pile. In the pictures, people looked sad, clumsy, and dirty. I continued, I got part of my deposit back on a bungalow on the Mexican coast that I wanted to surprise Claire with for our anniversary. Since that's not going to happen, I thought I'd buy something useful. Something flashed across Claire's face, disappointment, maybe. She was upset to learn there was more money than she thought. Looking down at the laid-out photographs, Mark finally sensed danger and fell silent. Claire turned pale against her tan. So, how long? She asked softly. We've been working together for almost 4 months. How did you know everything? I didn't really have to figure out anything. You didn't try to hide it. You just assumed we'd be too overwhelmed or too weak to do anything. Mark tried to regain the initiative and snorted derisively. So what? You two have fallen in love? Sophie smirked. I don't like him at all. He's a complete idiot, and she's a complete fool too. I don't like her at all, she said, her smile widening and taking on a predatory tone. But the intimacy? Oh God, it's incredible. Nothing like violent revenge to make you do all the dirtiest things you can imagine, she continued, looking straight at Claire, then turning her gaze to Mark. And a lot more than you'd ever think of. I certainly didn't. But a little rejection will go a long way in convincing a girl to try things. Claire recoiled as if she had been hit and looked at me. You can't do that. We were trying to make things work. Claire yelled. Well, that's nonsense, I laughed, but without any joy. Hardly. You were just biding time until the divorce was ready. You had sex with him 3 or 4 times a week while I was sitting with the kids and living like a damn monk. People have been coming to the office to give me bad news for months. Not only did you cheat, but you made it a public spectacle. We didn't have to do surveillance to find you. It was like following an EF5 tornado, just following the destruction. I felt my anger quickly building, but Sophie squeezed my leg, a subtle reminder to keep my composure. Sophie was calmer this time. She took the initiative into her own hands. Obviously, there will be divorces due to infidelity. It won't affect the money, but let's face it, it's fairer, and we'll be better off for it. My new hobby will be to make sure the whole world gets copies of the photos and a full explanation of how you destroyed your marriages, family, colleagues, employers. Damn, I'll find your first-grade Sunday school teacher, she said, focusing on Mark for a second. By the way, I'm moving in with my sister now, with Jamie. Having regained my composure, I added the clincher, leaning in slightly. A little more serious for you is the fact that you two were stealing money from a materials account at a construction company. It took us a long time to figure it out, but when Sophie realized you were spending like sailors on vacation, we knew it had to be from somewhere. Sophie and I had gathered more than enough evidence. There were tax issues, internet fraud, even one mail fraud charge. So, even if Mark's cousin puts up with this, you have serious problems. Perhaps enough for 5 to 10 years in prison for you, I pointed at Mark, and a couple of years in prison as an accessory for you, I pointed at Claire. Claire's eyes widened as she tried to defend herself. I didn't know. I thought it was his money I was putting in the account so that it wouldn't go to him during the divorce. I interrupted her. Yeah, you were keeping it for a friend. How often does that work in court? Besides, it puts that money right into our divorce. If my name were on that account, I'd think you were setting me up. It would end badly. Claire and Mark turned pale. I suspected they had toyed with the idea but decided against it. I suggested an alternative that Sophie and I had worked out. You have one chance at a slightly better future. Mark runs away, quits his job, and goes to the mountains at least 400 miles away. He takes his car, clothes, football trophies, and yearbook. Nothing else, not a damn thing. Sophie files for divorce due to abandonment. She still won't get anything because of the secret arrangement with his cousin. We won't give the evidence to the police or his cousin. If his cousin finds out on his own and takes action, well, that's a shame. I looked at Claire and continued, I'm filing for divorce with the intention of getting primary custody, no alimony, and no maintenance, with cheating as the reason. You agree to this, or you go to jail, and I take full custody. Claire gulped but nodded numbly. This applies to all our things. Make a list of everything you want, but it has to be short. You can keep your clothes and all those damn shoes. Sophie chimed in, he offered me your stuff, but the shoes are too small, and the clothes suck. I've stopped wearing underwear around him, so you can keep your granny panties. I sent Sophie a playful look as Claire barely held her breath. Get a job, move in with your parents, or with anyone, I don't care anymore, I continued. You can see the kids as much as you want. I won't interfere. You were a good mom. I won't even tell your parents what happened. I looked at them closely to make sure they were paying attention. This offer is a one-time deal. It expires tomorrow at midnight. If Mark's ass isn't on the road by then, we'll turn it over to his cousin and the police. The offer still stands only if both of you agree. Sophie leaned forward, showing off her impressive cleavage, probably for Claire's sake. You guys have achieved one amazing thing, bringing the two of us together. We meant it when we said we had nothing in common. We couldn't agree on a movie to save our lives, hated each other's music, and if he talked about any of his hobbies, I would fall into a coma. I added, and she's a shallow, emotional nitwit whose voice grates on my nerves like broken glass. Sophie continued, her gaze locked with Mark's, like a snake with its prey. So, when we were dating, when we were making plans to punish you, we were doing only one thing, having sex until we lost consciousness in the most perverted ways. If we had dinner together, it was only to gain strength for the next time, she said, looking at Claire. I can't believe you left him for that lowlife. I'm not bluffing. If you think so, join us next time, and you can watch. It'll probably make it even hotter. It's not at all possible, but watching you get your ass kicked by your husband would be completely insane. So, call me anytime if you want to watch. I looked at my watch and interjected. Remember the deal. Sorry, we have to go. I need to pick up the kids. I stood up and extended my hand to Sophie to help her up. She stood up and then leaned towards them. Go ahead and have sex again. We'll stop on the way back, and I'll have him in every possible way. She wasn't lying or exaggerating. We stayed at the hotel, and she was absolutely stunning. It looked like the way she told off Mark and Claire had turned her on to the limit. We engaged in wild love for hours before finally heading home. But something had changed in Sophie. Perhaps it was the clash with Mark and Claire, but the insane rage seemed to have disappeared. She was still just as sexually active, but that sparkling edge of real madness was gone. Claire almost beat me home. I had just put the kids to bed when she burst through the front door and froze. I hadn't meant to show her, but it smelled like Sophie. Claire has always had a sensitive nose, and the air freshener was an essential element in keeping our secret. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling with some emotion I couldn't identify. I sighed and sank into a chair. We should have talked months ago. Look, can we back up a little? You can't just let this ruin us. Stop. I raised my hand. The only person who ruined this marriage is standing right in front of me. She stared at me, her expression tight and unpleasantly desperate. There was nothing attractive about her in that moment. She looked broken, which she should have been, but I wasn't feeling sympathy. Just a deep, settling exhaustion. You really don't understand, Claire. You've got it better than Mark, and here's why. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Sophie bargained for you. She begged and begged on your behalf. She tried to make Mark the real villain in this story, and you have no idea how difficult that was for her. She hated you with every fiber of her being, but she did it anyway. She felt that her disaster caused ours. Claire blinked, confusion momentarily flickering through her gaze. What are you talking about? I'm not even sure I agree with her, but I accepted the deal because she begged me, I said slowly. If the money laundering account had been in my name, or if the DNA test on the twins had come back different, we wouldn't be talking. They're pouring the foundation for a factory on 5th Street, and I have a copy of the key to the construction site. You and that man would just disappear. Sophie could beg all she wanted, and it wouldn't matter. Claire suddenly seemed to realize just how alone we were in the house. Her eyes darted around nervously. How long do I have to move out? She asked quietly. I should have given her until midnight tomorrow, just for the damn neat symmetry of it all, but I said, I'll give you a week. It'll take you 2 days just to pack all those shoes, and God knows, I want them gone. She muttered something like an apology, then walked up the stairs slowly. She left after 5 days. And I was left alone with the children. Even with the twins, the house seemed emptier than ever. I heard through the grapevine that Mark's cousin was looking for him but hadn't called the police. I hope he hid himself well. The cousin always had a violent streak, and I wouldn't have put it past him to handle things his own way. I cheated a little on my promise not to let his cousin know. 2 weeks after that, I gave the twins to Claire and her parents for the weekend. They were aware of the rules, and Claire knew that any nonsense would lead to a fast track to prison. Almost at midnight, someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, Sophie was standing there in full war paint and club clothes, looking almost deliriously joyful. At least someone had adapted since she left. "I brought a housewarming gift," she said, flashing a bright smile. I almost corrected her. After all, I hadn't moved, but in a sense, she was right. The house seemed new somehow. It felt fresh, like a blank slate. "I thought we could share dessert," she added, stepping inside and revealing a familiar blonde face behind her. Emma. Poor Emma. She wasn't particularly experienced, but Sophie and I shared her like the delicacy she was. We pulled her into our storm, making her less a partner and more of a catalyst for an open flame. Not that she was complaining. After everything Sophie and I had done to each other over the past months, we were able to give Emma a crash course in pleasure. She lost consciousness twice. The next morning, Sophie smiled like the cat that ate the canary as she helped Emma, who could barely walk on her still wobbly legs, out to her car. A few nights later, Sophie came alone. A few nights after that, she came with Jamie. After the kids fell asleep, she wordlessly pulled me straight into the bedroom. This time, we moved slower, much slower. Afterward, I lay looking at the ceiling, her head resting on my shoulder while her finger traced a pattern on my chest. "We can't go on with this, Sophie," I murmured. I felt her tense up beside me. I continued softly, "We had some kind of agreement. I know we never said it outright, but I think we agreed that we had nothing in common. No feelings. Anne. I have a problem with that." There was a long silence, then she whispered, "You must have been a slow learner as a child. They probably had to bring in a specialist to teach you how to walk." I chuckled, and she glanced up at me, the hint of a smile on her lips. "I know what you're saying," she continued. "Anne. I don't know what I want either. This wasn't supposed to happen." "None of it was," I agreed. "But here we are. And I think, we need to let it go." Sophie sighed deeply, as if the weight of everything that had happened was finally pressing down on her all at once. "So, what now?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to figure something out. Before it's too late." She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. And in that moment, I knew that, no matter what happened next, things would never be the same between us again. Sophie stayed that night, but when morning came, she was gone. For the first time in months, I felt a strange emptiness inside. Not relief, just a hollow space where something used to be, and I knew that no amount of revenge or passion could ever fill it. After that night, when Sophie and I had our first real conversation, there was a silence between us. Not the kind of pleasant, soothing silence that embraces you in difficult moments. It was an emptiness that sucked all the emotions out of me. Sometimes I thought it was even worse than those wild days when we tried to numb the pain of betrayal with our unrelenting passions. I saw Sophie a few more times after that conversation. She would come over, sit next to me on the couch, and be silent. We watched TV, discussed trivial things like the weather or the news, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no passion, no frenzy, only the remnants of the old intimacy that was slowly melting away. One day, sitting in the kitchen, she looked up at me and said quietly, "I think we should end this." I knew she was right, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. I just nodded. She took the keys to my house out of her purse and put them on the table. "I'm not coming back," Sophie said, trying to hold back her tears. "I have to find myself, without you, without all this, without hate." Her words sounded like the final verdict on our strange and painful friendship, built on mutual suffering and revenge. I watched her rise from her chair, slowly walk across the living room, and leave the house without looking back. The following months were unbearably difficult. The empty space on the couch, the empty mornings without her calls, everything reminded me of how chaotically we tried to find a way out of the dead end we were in. I continued to work and take care of the kids, but I felt like I was left alone with the empty space that Sophie had left. I heard from her sister that Sophie moved to another city, found a job, and started a new life. From time to time, she went to a psychologist, trying to regain her balance. I wanted her to succeed. I think we both deserved a second chance. As for me, I changed my approach to life. I stopped chasing the illusion of controlling the situation. I learned to let go of the past and accept what I had. I no longer followed Claire, no longer collected evidence of her infidelity. I simply filed for divorce and ended this chapter of my life. A year later, I stood on the doorstep of the new house I had moved into with my children. The sun was slowly sinking behind the horizon, leaving the sky in golden pink hues. I set 2 cups of tea on the small table in the garden, remembering how Sophie and I had had tea in a similar silence. The only difference was that this silence did not seem empty. It was calm, complete. Suddenly, my phone rang in my pocket. I didn't expect to see her name on the screen, but there it was, Sophie. "Hi," I said, pressing the answer button. "Hi," her voice sounded confident, but I detected a hint of nervousness. "I just wanted to know how you are. How are the kids?" "We're fine," I answered, smiling into the phone. "And you?" "Everything is fine. I got the job I wanted, and I'm feeling better." She paused. "I'm even dating someone. But I wanted to tell you. I'm grateful for everything that happened. Even if it didn't bring me happiness." "I'm grateful too, Sophie," I answered honestly. "I hope everything works out for you." We talked some more, but I knew it was our last conversation. She wasn't coming back, and I was happy for her. For both of us. I sat down at the table again with a cup of tea, looking at the sunset. In life, it can be difficult to find the right words, but there are moments when silence speaks better than any phrase. It was just such a moment.